I am very appreciative of their stuff. I know. I'm very appreciative of what they're doing. And but so I couldn't really complain about Yom Kippur, the fact that we had to have it here. But as it turns out, I don't know. I'm gonna tell you all to be here. October 4th, Tuesday night. You better, Joyce, you better be here.
I'm coming with them.
Okay, yeah. You better be there. You better be there. Yeah, but I don't know. It's a good question. Will we have an overflow? I don't know. I don't know. She doesn't know. She doesn't. She looked like she knew. No, there's nothing. Can't do it. So yeah, that's the story, folks. And for those who aren't here and in person, I think you should come on and watch the tape of it or whatever, one way or the other. Let me put it this way. We'll make sure you see it. That's all and that's all I'm going to say about that. I'll be like Forrest Gump, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So let's take a look at the Torah. And for those who are not usually here, like the Stolmans and Joyce, you can actually see it up here on the wall in big letters. But we were reading the Ten Commandments last week, and for those who were not here, we read the first 4 of them, which is actually was a good break. I didn't know how many we'd read last week, but we did get to a good break because the commandments that we went through were the commandments that all deal with human beings and then the relationship with God. So the first 4 commandments, a lot of ways to break up the 10 commandments. There's only 10 of them, but there's a lot of ways to break them up, a lot of ways to look at them. And one of the ways that people look at them is that the first set of commandments are about the ways we interact between ourselves and God. They're the theological commandments. They're the ones that really are not necessarily the ones that deal with human beings, because we keep Shabbat to some extent. It's for our own health, but it's also because God commanded it and because we're acting in the image of God, as it says. It says that God made the heaven and earth and sea, and so we're like God when we rest on Shabbat. The interesting thing about it is there is an ethical part of Shabbat. It's not just a theological thing. It's not just a ritual. Because if you look at it, you're not supposed to do any work, or even your slaves. So Shabbat actually has an impact on the world, because if your workers aren't working on that day, then there is an element to it that has to do with you and your treatment of other people. Because if even a slave has a day off, that may be connected to Shabbat, it's maybe connected to the ritual, but the reality is there is a practical effect that it has on other people. And so if slaves have that, if slaves have a day off, then it means that Judaism says that even a slave would have certain rights and certain is treated in a certain way that, if you think about it, if your slave has a day off, you're not allowed to make your slave work on Shabbat. If you're getting value out of a slave and you're paying for a slave, you're losing 15% of your 14% of your value on that slave. If you can't work a slave one day a week, it means that slave is worth 14% less as far as what your value could be out of that than it would be for somebody else, a Gentile person who's buying the same slave. They're going to be worked 14% less because they can't work for you on Shabbat. And you get less value because you can't work that slave on Shabbat. So one can make the argument that the laws of Shabbat even start cracking apart slavery to some extent, because they basically turn slavery into at least a 15% less profitable or less economically advantageous situation for you. We can talk a lot about slavery and the way Judaism talks about slavery over time, but that is the rule, and that is the law for Shabbat. So Shabbat starts to seep into the way we deal with other humans. But the other ones that we looked at, the third one, which was not swearing falsely, the second one, of course, of not bowing down to idols, making idols, and the first one, we would say, is only having God as a God. That's the way we usually break them up. And that's, again, assuming that the second line or the first line of the commandments, the second verse of the Torah portion of the chapter, actually is the prologue or the preamble to the to the words that follow, which is, I'm the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Assuming that that's not a commandment, or some people would say, at least the way that it kind of translated this, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods besides me, as part of the same commandment, because they put a colon after that, right? That's at least the way they translated it. So sometimes it's not only the translation, it's the words, it's also the punctuation, because that assumes that that next verse is part of the same idea. So again, we understand that the commandments begin with the words Anochi Adonai Elohecha, which is interesting because, again, we didn't point this out last week, but might as well say it now. The word Anochi means I, right? It's translated there as I, Adonai, am your God. But the word I is actually the first word of the Ten Commandments. So God actually starts the commandment saying me, I, right? This is me speaking to you. So right away, there's an indication that the law is given directly by God. It's not given through, this is not about Moses. This is not about someone else telling you what the laws are. These laws are coming directly from God. And that's why the Ten Commandments is different from the other commandments in the Torah, which oftentimes are prefaced by the words Moses said to the people. It doesn't say that here. So where we were is Shabbat, and then we get to the fifth commandment, which is a very short commandment, but a very interesting one. Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that your God Adonai is assigning to you. So we know this law very well, and many people say that in actuality, this might be the hardest law to actually keep, because it's very hard. It's very hard to always be honoring your parents, even if you're a very good child. It's oftentimes very hard to do it. Of course, elsewhere in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, it actually says to revere or fear your mother and your father. It's phrased differently. Now, some people point out that, again, it's the reverse. It's the mother first and then the father. And there the word is yirah, which is reverence or fear. Fear, it's oftentimes translated as fear your mother and your father. So some people point out that the reason is in two places in the Torah, it tells us to honor or fear our parents. You maybe be more likely to honor your mother than your father, which is why the Torah reverses it here. And then in the other place, it says fear your mother and your father, because you might be more likely to fear your father. I know a lot of people feared their moms more than their dads. But the Torah says essentially, or at least the commentary on it is that in most normal in circumstances that people usually would have found themselves, they would be more likely to fear their father. And so that's why the Torah reverses it. Yes.
Could this be one of the things that kept the Jewish community cohesive throughout time, because the family was instructed to be more cohesive?
There's no question. The commandment here actually says that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning you. So that's an interesting one, because what it's saying is that there'll be continuity, that you'll actually survive if you follow this law, right? Now, of course, this is connected to the land that God is assigning you, meaning the land of Israel. So which assumes that once they get kicked out of Israel, maybe it's because they're not doing the right thing. Or that, again, this is a basic, as Joy said, it's a basic fundamental part of society that families have this structure. Yes, or have a family structure at all, with all seriousness. I mean, that. But okay. The idea, though, is why is it different in the Jewish communities? Because there is that expectation.
Yes.
It is not always followed, but the expectation is still there. And I do think that has something interesting. But beyond that, so we skip that because Joyce pointed out, so that society will continue, which is what the Torah actually says. But what's even more amazing about it is that this is the only commandment where there's a reward given in the commandment itself. None of the other commandments, you'll see, you haven't seen it so far, and you won't. I'm ruining it by telling you, but keep an eye for it, see if I'm wrong. The rest of the commandments also don't say anything about the consequences. This is the only one that says there'll be a consequence if you don't follow it. You follow it, this will happen to you. None of the other commandments, and it doesn't say that a lot in the Torah. a lot of, there's 613 commandments. Not a lot of them finish with, and that's why you'll get something in return, or that's why good things will happen to you, or you'll make God happy if you do it. It doesn't never says that, by the way, but it does say here that there's actually a consequence to it, and there's actually, if you will, a reward for it. There's something good that'll happen to you if you follow it. And again, sometimes there are warnings, right? If you break this, bad things will happen too. There's a lot of warnings in the Torah, but this one's actually specifically assigned to one commandment. So yes, Joyce, not only is it, part of what.
We have been for it as a people.
Yeah. Now, you could say, but surely the other communities have similar things going on. But I will tell you that this was one of the trickier parts that Christianity to some extent separated from, at least within Catholicism, was of course the Catholic clergy were not only not encouraged to have families, but were prohibited at a certain point to have families. So then we go to that, like, how could you even come up with that based on what we have in the Torah? You're basically saying, well, you're not having families anymore, but a priest still has parents, right? Every priest has parents. So they're not breaking a commandment by not having kids, other than you could say, be fruitful and multiply is a commandment. Not exactly sure about that, by the way, which is why they would say, first of all, they don't have to keep the commandments anyways. But even for those Christians that say, I'm not breaking the 10 commandments, I'm not breaking the 10 commandments by not having kids. But there is an issue within Christianity, and it does exist to some extent, is what happens if your parent doesn't believe the same thing you do? Now, Judaism kind of touches on this a little bit, but Christianity flat out says, if your family doesn't follow you, you leave them behind. And they might not. Because to some extent, Christianity was putting a radical idea in there, which is that if the world ends tomorrow, it doesn't matter what happens to your family. You got to think about what's going on in your own soul, your own salvation. So there are lines in the Christian Bible where Jesus basically says, you don't worry about your worldly family anymore. This is something that allows, to some extent, for people to say, hey, I can't, if my family doesn't get on board, I leave them behind. I remember years ago, somebody asked, well, it's a bad example, but they asked Mel Gibson about his wife, because his wife wasn't Catholic, which means she didn't take communion and she didn't follow Catholicism. And they basically said, hey, what's going to happen? Your wife's not going to be saved? He goes, I guess not. Not my problem. I mean, he didn't say it's not my, he kind of said that. Well, they're divorced. I mean, obviously now, but at the time it was kind of, people said, why is he basically saying his wife can go to hell? I guess later on he kind of felt that, but people were shocked by that. But it's not shocking when when you've been indoctrinated in a certain kind of theology where that happens. And again, it's not pervasive in Christianity. Obviously, Christianity is solidified and pretty much kept this idea that you have to have a strong family unit. But there are texts in the story, which in Jesus' story, which are fairly radical in some ways. And of course, people pointed to Jesus' own life and said he didn't have a family. Though some people believe he did, but Gospels are pretty clear that he didn't have a family. But anyways, the point is that the family structure within Judaism starts with the way you treat your parents, period. End of story. Now that's, I remember as a kid, reading this and going, come on, to what extent are we supposed to do this? And I remember my teachers telling me as a kid, if you're sitting in your dad's chair when he gets home and that's his chair for dinner, my dad didn't do that, but you get out of the chair. You don't sit in your dad's chair when he comes home from dinner for dinner. So it was a serious thing. And I think you understand it more when you're a parent. It's one thing to objectively say, hey, I'm going to honor my parents, I'm going to do my best. But when you have kids, I don't know. In my experience, I had a lot more appreciation for my parents once I had kids. It changed my whole perspective on what they did and what they went through. And I was much more, I was a much better child and a much more appreciative child after I had children myself. That's my experience. That's my experience. I mean, yeah, I think so. I think so, but I would hope so. I would hope it chastens you a little bit and you realize, oh man, this is a hard job. So that being said, the Torah doesn't really give you any wiggle room here. It says you do it. And of course, there are people always ask the same thing. What if your parent asks you to do something that goes against the Torah? What if they ask you to break a law of the Torah? And the Torah is, you could be in that situation. Actually, you could be in that situation by the next lines we're about to read, right? It says in the next line, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Well, usually your parents aren't going to ask you to do the first two. Those aren't usually part of our normal routine. But what if your parent tells you to steal? What if your parent tells you to lie, bear false witness against your neighbor? You're breaking one of the commandments, one of the 10 commandments, not just a commandment. How's that any, the commandment's right there in this other commandment. You can't say, well, it's above that one and you don't follow the ones below it. So the Torah says, if your parent asks you to break a commandment, you don't follow them. You don't listen to them. You don't say, oh, well, I have to because my parent told me to. No. If your parent asks you to break the law or to break a commandment, you're not supposed to listen to it. So there are boundaries, right? There are boundaries. And we oftentimes look at when the Torah has two conflicting, when it essentially is turned on itself, what do you say? And the Torah says you can't. You can't honor your parents by breaking another commandment. So you can't use that as a defense. But those ones do happen. I mean, there are parents who raise their children to steal and to be criminals. I mean, it happens a lot. It happens a lot. And there are parents who implicate their kids in their crimes, sometimes even without direct, well, who knows the direct involvement. I'm thinking about the Madoffs are probably the biggest one I come to mind with, but both of his sons died. One of them committed suicide and one of them died not too long after, cancer. And they were embarrassed by their father. One of them helped turn him in, but the reality is that you get implicated even by just your name to some extent. So there are consequences. We know that. Look, some people point out that this law of honoring your parents is actually the nexus point. It's the focal point, the fulcrum, if you will, between the laws that came before it and the laws that come after, right? Because the laws that came before it, the previous 4 commandments, are all about the way we deal with God. And then the rest of the commandments deal with humanity. And here our parents are as the focal point, as the pendulum, as a whatever, not a pendulum, but the fulcrum between our parents and God. They're the place where those things meet, because our parents are our creators with God. And so the first people, essentially, the people who brought us into this world, the people that we interact with so much, are our parents. And that's really how we start to learn how to interact with other people. And our parents, to some extent, are that connecting point between God and humanity. So that's why it's a really interesting placement here as the first commandment. It deals with ethical behavior. So some would say it's the perfect commandment then that leads us into the last 5 commandments, which, as we just saw, 3 of them we get hit with, or 4 of them we get hit with real quick. And they're all 2 words. Yeah, John.
But do you notice if you go up to that sentence to your mother or father, it's a bargain, right?
Yeah.
If you read the sentence,
yeah,
and you read each word,
yeah,
right, it's a bargain. Right, the other commandments, there's no bargain.
There's no bargain. Yeah, there's no consequence to it, right? So there's not, as I said, it doesn't happen in the Torah a lot, where you actually get the bargain, the consequence, the reward. So the rest of them, of the commandments, as I said, don't have that at all. None of them have it. And there are a few in the Torah where we do get it, but not many places where there is a bargain. So these ones hit real fast. Lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov. And then this last one is actually a couple words. Lo ta'neh b'ra'echa ad shaker, which is you shall not, usually translated as you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Is that what the King James has there, Mary? So the commandment, so commandments 6, 7, 8, and 9 are clearly, to some extent, I mean, we'd say these are ethical, the ways we treat other people. Now, people have pointed out, lo tirtzach is translated as you shall not murder. What does the King James have? Yeah, bad translation. That's where the King James clearly was problematic. Because tirtzach doesn't mean kill. It means murder. It's premeditated murder. It's killing someone who didn't deserve to die. So clearly, the Torah doesn't say you shall not kill, because you're allowed to kill someone who's trying to kill you. You're allowed to kill someone in battle. You're allowed to execute somebody with capital punishment. So it can't be thou shalt not kill. So tirtzach is not the word for kill. We have other words for kill. Hareg. We have versions of the word mot, which means to die, but also to execute. This is not the word. This is a word specifically for willfully knowledge with knowledge of forethought, right? Premeditated. That's what this is. It's not accidentally killing someone either. It's not manslaughter. This is murder, and it's should be translated as such. So thou shalt not kill has been problematic over the years. And to some extent, look, it's been mistranslated and misunderstood to some extent for a long time. The Torah doesn't say that. It says not to murder. The next law of not committing adultery is an interesting one, because the Torah clearly has many stories of men who are married to more than one wife, and they're not committing adultery. So, of course, this gets into what the definition of adultery is. By the Torah definition, obviously, it's not a man being married to more than one wife. So they're specifically talking about a man having sexual relations with someone who's not their wife, who's married to somebody else. That's what the Torah actually is saying, but it doesn't, of course, it doesn't say that. It says committing adultery, which is exactly, of course, what the King James says. It doesn't say anything other than that word, lo tinaf. But again, it was by the biblical definition. Now, already by the rabbinic period was already not prohibiting multiple wives, called polygamy. It frowned upon it, and it discouraged it. So by 2,000 years ago, by the time of Jesus, it was not common for Jews to have more than one wife. Very important to know that. It's clear that in Jesus' time, by the time of the rabbis, by the time of Rabbi Hillel, who lived a little bit before, in the Talmud, the Mishnah, almost all the rabbis we encounter there are married to one woman.
Can you imagine being married to two?
Don't say Jewish women, any woman. So the issue is, again, when people have talked about it from the biblical side, I'm getting one thing out here. Don't worry, it's nothing inappropriate. It is not, it is, I mean, I guess the point is that people would say that that's holding people up to a standard that would be very difficult for them to keep based on the Torah definition. Judaism had no issue telling people, yeah, but you know what it means. So they did not encourage serial philandering from a man's standpoint just because he's having sex with women that are not married. That's not okay. They didn't say that that was okay. They understood that that behavior was problematic, had consequences, was a way to undermine society, was not moral, was not psychologically healthy for people. But it doesn't break the 10 Commandments. So that was where the kind of issue became it became more of an issue. So clearly, most Jews today understand this as, okay, you can't. So Israel you cannot be married to more than one woman in Israel. It's not allowed. Israel doesn't allow bigamy. But the issue from the Jewish standpoint is they couldn't prohibit it because they couldn't say that by Jewish law that it was prohibited, because it's not. So what they do is they follow the law that we have that's been in existence for the Jewish community for about the last 1,000 years, which is that the rabbis decided in the Middle Ages that when Jewish people were living in a society where polygamy was not accepted, it's not accepted by the Jewish community either. But the law of the land would dictate that the social structures that they followed. But that didn't officially go into play until about 1,000 years ago. But again, for at least 1,000 years before, it was not common for people to have more than one wife. The one exception I would say is that some Jewish communities in Arab countries, they did follow laws that at least allowed for polygamy. So there were Jews, for example, in Morocco and Yemen who had multiple wives. And what Israel did is they grandfathered those people in and allowed them to come to Israel with, both wives. But then they didn't allow it to happen any other times after that. So that was the accommodation that Israel made to allow people to make aliyah, but at the same time, and not break up their families, but to recognize that they weren't going to continue the policy. So that's where it stands from the Jewish standpoint. The next law of not stealing, lo tignov, is an interesting one because people would say, how strict is this law? Right? What's the definition of stealing? And so we use the word all the time. We say, don't be a ganef. The word ganef in Hebrew is tignov, from the word ganav, which means to steal. So that's a Hebrew word, which became a Yiddish word. And a lot of people know the word ganef. Don't be a ganef. Don't be a thief. But usually we use that we use the Yiddish term at least, not when we're talking about, outright theft. But usually we're talking about it by being dishonest in business practices. Don't be a ganef. So it's more like, don't steal from your partner. Don't steal from, don't try to do things that, cut corners with money that would create a situation so that you're perceived to be acting in a morally, dubious way. And so we use it in pretty broad ways, not to be a thief. So it can expand really, really far out. Look, it goes so far out that the rabbis actually frowned on gambling. Not because, again, there's any biblical commandment against it, but because they felt that it leads to thievery. Now you could say, it's because people who gamble will maybe start stealing to feed their gambling addiction, which is true, but more concretely, they felt that taking advantage of people, right, allows for you to essentially steal from them because they're not aware of the odds, or they're not aware of the implied house advantage. Now you could say, well, you're stupid because every casino that you go into, that's a beautiful building and they're giving you a free hotel room and they're giving you free, discounted food or whatever. You're doing that because they know they're going to make money off of you. They know that, you're not, but still this idea that there's a house advantage is a problem from the standpoint of taking advantage of people and essentially stealing from them, which is why gambling is not allowed in Israel. There are no casinos in Israel. There's no sports betting. There's no bookmaking. There's no.
Native Americans.
They have Palestinians, which interestingly, they had talked about it. They actually had built a casino in Jericho when they first thought that there was actually going to be a peace treaty. they actually built a huge casino in Jericho because they were hoping that essentially Israelis would go down the road 30 miles, 20 miles from Jerusalem and go to the casino on native land, if you Palestinian land, whatever, in Jericho, a city where there were no Jews. So they built a beautiful hotel. You can still see it, the remnants of it. It was in operation for about a year or so. And then it just, when everything went to hell during the Intifada, they closed it. So that doesn't mean Israelis don't gamble. They love gambling. Actually, some of the best poker players in the world are Israelis. They're always doing well in the World Series and stuff like that. They go to Turkey to gamble. They go to Egypt to gamble. They go to other places nearby for casinos. Israeli customers are important there. But Israel itself will not allow casinos. And I don't think they're going to. And people bet online. You can still go online and do stuff like that. But they do have a lottery in Israel. They have a national lottery. It's not very popular, but they have a lottery. And the reason that they do the lottery is because they say that that's a pooled amount of money. Nobody has, the odds are all well known. They know that there's the amount that the country takes out of it, but essentially you're basically pooling people's money together and then distributing it back out. So they said it's not really an issue, but it's, like I said, it's not a very big, people don't get that excited about the lottery, but they do have a national lottery. That's the extent of gambling in Israel, because again, they felt that it was, to some extent, could if not stealing, it could be easily turned into something that could be considered stealing and breaking Jewish law. So it's understood in a very broad way, stealing. And then the last law, which seems like maybe one of the least relevant from the standpoint of our day-to-day lives, it's usually translated as, or at least when you're a kid, they tell you this is that you shall not lie, not to lie. It's not exactly what it says. It's talking about something specific, which is bearing false witness against people in a court, in a situation where there's a legal situation.
Would that also include gossip?
Look, I mean, it doesn't, but there are places in the Torah where it says not to slander or to gossip. So in Leviticus, it actually says full stop. We have a law about this. But, you could say by this, saying something bad about somebody else or making up a story about them. But really what it is it's actually testifying.
I got it.
Now, I mean, this is really serious, which is why it's grouped together with really serious stuff, because lying about somebody in a court of law could wind up getting them killed. So it's really bad. The consequences of it are terrible, because essentially, if you go to court and you can't trust the witnesses, you've got no system. There's no trial. You can't have a trial if you can't trust the witnesses. Which is why, again, if you ever go to court, if you ever are in a case, especially, a civil case where, someone's life is at stake or something serious is going down, they'll go after the witnesses, So if the prosecution comes in with a bunch of witnesses that are testifying against somebody, they'll come in, the defense will come in and rip apart the prosecution's witnesses. Let's say this person's got no credibility. This person's a liar. This person was hired to do this. This person's getting a deal to testify. So this is a big issue. It's still a big issue, and it's something that we take very seriously in Judaism. Look, we actually went even further with this, which is essentially, we actually demanded, at least in capital cases, that if a witness was coming forward, you actually had to have witnesses who could testify to the veracity of the witness. You actually had to have them in a capital case. So if somebody came and said, I saw this person do it, you'd have to have then people come in and say, I know this person to be a truthful person. You actually had to have that. Otherwise, you had no witness. If somebody couldn't testify to the veracity, to the character of the witness, that you couldn't even bring them to court with you. So it's a pretty strict law in Judaism, witnesses. And we're actually going to, so weird how this happened, but we're actually going to be reading this story in next week's Tuesday, not next week's Tuesday, because we don't have class on Tuesday, But the week after, on our Tuesday morning class, we're actually going to be reading this story.
You're not gonna be reading in the week of the Tuesday, it's Yom Kippur.
Yeah, it's in the morning. I'm doing class in the morning Tuesday. I'm not doing class on Tuesday of Rosh Hashanah, but I am. Oh, yeah, no, I looked at it. What? Next Wednesday is after, yeah. Yeah. No, not the week after. That's Yom Kippur. Yes, she's right. But Tuesday morning, we're having class. No, we're not missing 2 weeks. Look, you know what? Because most of you, a lot of you, especially those people online, are not going to be there Tuesday. I'm going to show you a little taste of this story. I'm going to look. There's a chance when we get into playoffs, we might miss a Wednesday night class. I will not lie to you. I will not lie to you about that. I will not testify falsely. What? We did? No, we did?
Yeah,
We did?
don't remember.
Was it during the World Series?
I don't know.
Well, it was during the World Series. It was 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago. It was when the Dodgers won the World Series. If they were going to lose, I wasn't going to miss class for them losing. No, they won. I think they won. It was the year they won in 2020.
I don't
We
remember.
had to watch it.
You call up.
We had to watch it. I don't remember. It was 2 years ago. We didn't miss last year when they went into with the Braves. So, oh wait, so here I was going to show you. This is the text from. I'm going to show you the text from Kings. So here's and I'm going to show you why. I have to show it to you guys. It's not like I'm not, even though you're not going to, even though you should be with us on Tuesday, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that.
We'll be here Tuesday.
I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. So I'm going to show you a quick story. So you'll have read it a little bit more, those people. So here's the story of what I'm talking about here. The Tuesday. This one's it's in one chapter away. Or one, yeah, it's just a really long chapter. Okay, here's the story. Here we go. So here we go. I'm sharing this other page. This is the one from Kings. So this is chapter 21 of Kings, and we're in 20. It's or 19, I think. So this is a story. Naboth, the Jezreelite, owned a vineyard in Jezreel, which makes sense. He's from Jezreel, right? Adjoining the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. And Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it as a vegetable garden." So he wanted to repurpose this guy's garden. As his next door neighbor. "Since it is right next to my palace, I will give you a better vineyard in exchange. Or if you prefer, I will pay you the price in money." Seems like a good deal. King wants your property. We have the law of eminent domain now anyways, and they kind of did. But he's the king. But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give up to you what I inherited from my fathers." This is not going to go well. Because we already know Ahab. For those who are with us, Ahab's not a good guy. And his wife's even worse. Ahab went home and dispirited and sullen because of the answer that Naboth the Jezreelite had given him. "I will not give up to you what I inherited from my fathers." He lay down on his bed and turned away his face, and he would not eat. A little bit of a baby, but it's not. But wait, we already know his wife, his name is Jezebel. You've heard of her, Joyce. You know Jezebel. You know a Jezebel, maybe. That's why she's nodding. His wife Jezebel came to him and asked him, "Why are you so dispirited that you won't eat?" So he told her, "I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and proposed to him, 'Sell me your vineyard for money, or if you prefer, I'll give you another vineyard in exchange.' But he answered, 'I will not give my vineyard to you.'" By the way, he didn't say the other part, which is, "I got it from my dad. I can't," or my grandparents, whatever. We've had it in our family for generations. He doesn't say that. He just says the important point, which is, he said no. He told me no, right? He said no to me. I'm the king, right? So everything else he said to her was exactly verbatim of what he said, but he does not tell her, of course, exactly what he said. Now, look at Jezebel. His wife Jezebel said to him, "Now is the time to show yourself king over Israel. Rise and eat something and be cheerful. I will get the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite for you. Well, so that's interesting too. She doesn't even just tell him what to do. She says, I'll take care of it. That's what she said. This woman's, she's an evil woman, but she knows how to take care of business. She does not like to see her husband acting sad when he comes home, and takes care of business. So look what this woman does. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who lived in the same town with Naboth. In the letters she wrote as follows: proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the front of the assembly, and seat 2 scoundrels opposite him, and let them testify against him. You have reviled God and king. Then take him out and stone him to death. His townsmen, the elders and nobles who lived in his town, did as Jezebel had instructed them, just as was written in the letters she had sent them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the front of the assembly. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him, and the scoundrels testified against Naboth publicly as follows: Naboth has reviled God and king. He took him outside the town and stoned him to death. Word,
2 weeks from now.
yeah, it's just one story. Stop it. Word was sent to Jezebel: Naboth has been stoned to death. And as soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, go and take possession of the vineyard, which Naboth the Jezreelite refused to sell you for money, for Naboth is no longer alive. He's dead. Which is another way of saying he's no longer alive. Notice, by the way, she doesn't just say he's not alive. He's dead. Of course, she had him killed. So that's the way they got, yeah.
She had him murdered.
Yeah.
Put that to a movie.
Yep, exactly. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab set out for the vineyard of Naboth and to take possession of it. So the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Go and confront King Ahab, who resides in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard. He has gone down there to take possession. Say to him, thus said the Lord, would you murder and take possession? Thus said the Lord, in the very place where the dogs lapped up Naboth's blood, the dogs will lap up your blood too. Guess what? If you want to read the rest of the story, you got to come back on Tuesday, 2 weeks. But you see what I'm saying here, right, John? This stuff.
That's right. You took it. You wrote this.
This is much, much scarier than Game of Thrones, because this not only happened, not only real, but we were responsible for this. Now, Jezebel, of course, is Phoenician, so she's not exactly Israelite, but the Israelites do pretty bad stuff too. This is this is exactly what we just read. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, that can't be a coincidence.
Well, and you have murder.
Yeah, and you have murder.
Conspiracy.
Uh-huh.
You have felony.
You have stealing. So this is a law broken right there brazenly in the Torah, which leads to all these other stuff. Commandments, the previous commandments. And of course, Jezebel and Ahab were responsible for idolatry and everything else. So why is this so important? Why is this in the book of Kings? Why is this story here? Well, that gets to this book right here. It's a very short book. It's only about 100 pages. Actually, the text itself is 100 pages. I think he probably did it on purpose. This was written by one of my professors, David Noel Friedman of blessed memory. He was the endowed chair at University of Michigan, where Joyce is from, but also the endowed chair at UC San Diego. Now, very few people get to be endowed chairs at 2 universities, but he was that good. And he was a really nice guy too. An interesting guy. Very interesting guy. An amazing, he forgot more about the Bible than most professors ever know. And I mean professors. He was the editor of the Anchor Bible series, which was one of the big commentaries that Jews and mainly Christians used for a long time. The Anchor Bible is still in existence, but it's a really great commentary of each book of the Bible. So it's hardcore stuff. I mean, you got to be pretty into the Bible to get the Anchor Bible, but he was the editor in chief. He didn't write all of them, but he reviewed all of them. And he did write a couple of them. So he wrote this book called The Unity of the Hebrew Bible. And his theory behind it is that somebody took the history of the Jewish people from Deuteronomy all the way to the end of Kings and organized the history we call it, the people call it the Deuteronomistic history or the history of the kings. It goes from Moses from Moses's final words down to the book of Kings. And in that structure, this is his theory, that the Israelites break every one of the 10 commandments. And there's a breaking of a commandment in Deuteronomy. There's a breaking of a commandment in Joshua. There's a breaking of a commandment in Samuel, Judges and Samuel. And as you go through them, the pattern emerges, he says, that they broke every one of the commandments. And like some of them are like really weird. Like this one's super weird. Like this story, he says, the reason that Naboth's story is even in the Bible, because like Ahab does terrible things. Like, why is this story there? We read how Ahab and Jezebel killed all the prophets of God. Like, why is that story not there? It just says it. But this story's here. This one guy, Naboth, we read about, he says it's not a coincidence. It's an example of this commandment. Now we have one more commandment. You'll see we have one more commandment coming up. But for example, like in the commandments are broken, like the one that was broken just before this, one of the ones right before this, is not committing. Now he says that this actually is two, his theory is that this is two. You shall not steal and you shall not bear false witness. But the one that he says, like, so we just read the book of Kings, but for those who are with us on Tuesdays, before that, we read the book of Samuel. Now, Samuel has one really powerful story of adultery. That's the story of David and Bathsheba. And he says that's the breaking of do not commit adultery. Now, there's a lot of murders in the Bible, so it's a little bit harder to find those, but there is one very, very conspicuous story of murder that we read in Judges, which is the story of the concubine that was murdered, raped and murdered in the story of Judges. And it's a very troubling story. It's in Judges chapter 19. And he says that's the murder story. So if you go judge, and you can go backwards and you see the breaking of the commandments. Where do the commandments get broken before that? Well, we make an idol in the book of Exodus, right? We build the golden calf. So he says all the way you go through the way the story is kind of organized when you go through Deuteronomy and you go through all the way through the end. I mean, even the story of the golden calf is repeated in Deuteronomy, but his theory, again, this book is basically on this idea that the Bible was organized around that. What's the point? After the Israelites break all 10 commandments, deal's off, and they get exiled. God's no longer going to protect them because they broke the commandments. So they had a covenant commandments we're reading about right now. And once you break the commandments, all of them, you're out. And they're broken in a very conspicuous way. So he says that this commandment, this one of not bearing false witness, is so obvious. It's so blatant in the book of Kings, which is the last book of the history. So when we're done with Kings, we're not reading history anymore. We go into the prophets. We have a lot more to read in Kings, believe me, but so that's his theory. He actually, I'll tell you, he had me, because I was a student of his, he actually had me come in one day and he was out of town. And he had me teach the class one day. And I don't remember, he was teaching this whole thing in a, like a 10-week class. So each week was like a different commandment. So I got to teach, I wish I could remember which one I got to teach, but I did get to teach one class for him. And I'll never forget, I got to teach this, this theory to people. And it was an undergraduate class, but I was an undergraduate at the time. So I was like, most of the people were older than me in the class. And they were coming up to me going, is this going to be on the test? I go, I have no idea. Don't ask me. I said, I'm here to teach one class. I'm way over my head here. I didn't say that, but I said, I have no idea what's going to be on the test, but it was an honor to be able to teach it. But I'll never forget this theory, because not a lot of people know about this theory, but this theory is important because, as you can see, the unity of the Hebrew Bible. So if there's actually an organizing principle for how the history is laid out, then the editor of the Bible intended for us to actually walk away with a lesson from this, which is a lesson that most people don't even know. And some people would say it's actually the organizing principle behind the history itself, which means that an editor actually chose the way this was. And he's not the first person to say that. He's just saying there actually is an organizing principle behind it. So some people believe this theory and some people don't, but it's definitely an interesting theory. And I think there's got to be something to it because of this story of Naboth. I think there's more to it. And I think he's right. I think there's more to the structure because this is such a strange story to include in the Bible. So we have one more commandment of the 10. We don't have one more commandment. We have one more commandment of the 10. Let me get rid of this. And this one is you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or ass or anything that is your neighbor's. That's the last commandment. Now, this is a weird commandment because it's also a commandment that has to do with overarching feelings rather than actual putting into practice. But here's an interesting thing that he said. I'm just going to tell you what he said. Guess what? The coveting is what led to Naboth getting his vineyard taken away, because it was actually King Ahab's coveting that led him to that, wanting to have that guy's property. So this is a tough one because a lot of people have pointed out the Bible doesn't really, usually hold us up for our thoughts, only for our actions, for our behavior. And so, he kind of says the only way that makes sense is if it's kind of connected to this story and it's connected to this kind of idea that all of those things that get done by kings and get done by powerful people come from this, which is coveting. Because that's what happens with King David and Bathsheba. He covets Uriah's wife. So this is, to some extent, like the explanation for these other things that come before it. But it's a very weird one because, or starting kind of from here, these last commandments, because it is really weird that this one is, if you will, a rule of, I don't know, let's see what this note is. It probably just says, yeah. So that's just an explanation for why it doesn't say spouse. It's basically, again, the point of the coveting here, lo tachmod, which is the translation, is a weird one because it isn't that you have to take it, it's that you actually desire it. So John, what does the Plout have to say? What's the commentary of coveting there? John's got the Plout commentary.
Desire improperly the hope to dispose one's neighbor. The most inward of the commandments, it is directed against one's greedy impulses. Deuteronomy, an additional word for covet is used. The word is crave.
Yeah.
But this difference is too stylistic.
Yeah. So we're not going to deal. We haven't dealt with it too much, but yes, there is another version of the commandments in Deuteronomy, which is why it's called the Deuteronomistic history, which is that the second time we read the 10 Commandments, it was put there by the historian, by the person who wrote Deuteronomy, to then lead off to the commandments. And again, there's very minor differences between the rules, the way they're presented, and they're all there. It's just a little bit, there's a couple words that are different. But yeah, overall, the lines in the Exodus are completely repeated in Deuteronomy. So as it points out, it's the most inward of the commandments because it really is focusing on your impulses rather than on your behavior. But a lot of people say that the issue of why it says covet and not desire in the first place, which is not even the word that they use in Deuteronomy. But if you look at this, it's the idea that coveting is actually not just wanting something. It's, as John read, it's the impulse to try to figure out how you're going to get it from them, right? So it's not just saying, oh, I really like what they have. It's, how do I get it from them? How do I now get it from that from them? Yeah.
I have footnotes.
Cool. Yeah, Gloria, what are yours?
By the way,
Which Bible do you have there?
I have the New International.
The NIV, which is a
So
great
mine is,
translation. Yeah.
modern.
Yeah, the NIV is a very popular Protestant used translation. I'd say the NIV is one of the most popular, and then of course the one a lot of people have heard, the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. Those are two of the most prominent Protestant ones. The New American Bible is the Catholic translation, but all of them have more modern. They try to get the modern meaning of the words rather than using the poetic words, which the King James does. But the King James also tries to get to the literal Hebrew. The NIV tries to get to the meaning of it and is not as worried as a word for word translation, but they want to know, well, what does it actually mean? So it's made with the intention of helping us understand it. So what's the translation
Well,
there for?
Mine has little notes.
Yeah.
So, the verse actually says, you will not covet. But, the footnote says, desire something with evil motivation.
Just similar
Break
idea.
God's commandments inwardly is equivalent to breaking them outwardly.
Interesting. Well, that's an interesting translation because that actually opens it up. That actually opens it up to not just coveting, but other things, and kind of opening it up to other ways of looking at that. I mean, look, there's another reading of this too, which is that when it says coveting your neighbor's house, you should covet, his property, things that belong to him. One of the traditions is that it's one thing to desire. So your neighbor comes home with a car that you really like. It's, I really like that car. I like that new BMW they have, right? It's got all the bells and whistles. You go say, I want to get that car, right? So you go, I asked my neighbor, where did you get your car? How much you pay for it? What'd you get? And you try to get that same car. There's a difference if you say, I want that car that he has and only that car, and I'm going to do everything I can to get that car from him, which is similar to saying, hey, my neighbor has a lovely wife. She's a lovely person. She's beautiful inside and out. I'd like to have a wife just like her. Or if you say, I want to have that exact woman, and I'm not going to stop until I have that exact woman. That's the difference. And that's what they say coveting is different from desiring. And it's a fixation on that exact thing, so that you don't want to get something like it, but that you have to have that thing. And that could be a way of understanding why the word is different. What is covet versus desire? But it's definitely problematic from the standpoint of, but it seems to be internal. It seems to be going on what's inside your head. And the Torah doesn't usually talk about that. It usually doesn't say, hey, look, you've got to think in a certain way. Look, it is something that, it is something that it does open it up. And it's interesting, Glory's translation, because I'm going to show you something really interesting, which is I'm going to show you Deuteronomy in a quick second too, because I got to show you. But before I get to Deuteronomy, I'm actually going to skip ahead even further, which is there's another version of the 10 Commandments. You've heard them before because they're called the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus in the book of Matthew, we have him speaking to the crowds, Mount Beatitudes. It's a place where he says, blessed are the, he goes into a whole preamble of who's blessed. And it's beautiful, blessed are the peacemakers, right? So, you've heard this, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That's from that, right? So he goes on, right? And then he says very famously, I did not come here to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. He says, I'm not here to undo the Torah, which is interesting because that would mean that Christians have to keep the Torah. And he says, for I truly tell you, until the heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, nor the least stroke of a pen, which is the famous translation. If you look at, Mary looks up at Matthew right now, it'll say not a jot or tittle, right? I don't know what the NIV has for that. But of course, the real translation should be not a yud or not even a dot under the yud. And of course, what is a yud? It's the tiniest little letter in the Torah, right? You barely can see a yud. And he says, not even a dot under the yud, which by the way, tells us that by Jesus' time, people were already putting in vowels on the Torah, by the way, which tells us that they couldn't read the Torah without vowels, by the way. Right? It came by this point. There's people already putting dots. Why? Because it says right there, not the little stroke of a pen, which again, I'm not sure, by the way, which translate 2,000 years ago. Yeah. So therefore, I mean, with it, within a few years, therefore, anyone who sets aside any one of these commandments and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, right? So he tells people, you better not break these laws. And he tells them, you better follow the laws. And he says, like the Pharisees, which are the precursors to the rabbis, you better follow those laws as strictly as they are. Because the Pharisees were really keeping the law. And he actually makes fun of the Pharisees in many places. But he says, you better keep the law like they do. And they are keeping the law. So now here's what he says. This is what Jesus says about the Ten Commandments. You have heard it said that people long ago, you shall not murder. That's the thing, we just read that. It's the Torah. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with your brother and sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, rakah, right, is answerable to the court. Anyone who says you fool, and you look, see the note, say rakah, right? It's saying a bad word to somebody. You don't curse at somebody, right? He uses the Aramaic, which is why they didn't really translate it. They just gave you the word. And anyone who says you fool will be in danger of fire, hell, right? So he's telling people, you better not even get mad at each other. You heard in the Ten Commandments not to be angry. I say you don't even get angry. Now, here's where he says he's going to talk about adultery. Oh my gosh, you know this part, right? You've heard it said you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks lustfully has already committed adultery with his heart. So there you go. How do we get that? Because it says in the Torah, you're not supposed to covet. It's a very famous story, right? That years ago, Jimmy Carter gave an interview to Playboy magazine, right? You remember that? He says, I've committed adultery many times in my heart. People were like, whoa, this guy's pretty religious. And he was, or he is, I'm still alive. So don't look lustfully. You've already committed adultery. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. I'm telling you, this is radical. This is not little bit. This is the Sermon on the Mount. This is the same sermon that says, blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. It's pretty serious stuff, right? If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better to lose a part than all go to hell, right? So this is some pretty heavy stuff. So this is his version of the Ten Commandments. This is his version of the law. He goes on to talk about divorce. Yeah. And he says, you better not be getting divorced, right? But he says, if you do, you better, if you give him a get, but he says, if you do, look what happens. I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, better have a good reason. Then you're making her a victim of adultery. Whoa. So, he goes on to talk about oaths. He goes on for an eye. These are other parts of the Torah. Now you're going to say, well, how does he get to that? You're going to see in 1 second. But he talked about some of the bigger things of the Torah. And here you've heard it say, love your neighbor, which it says, right? It says that in Leviticus. And he says, I tell you right now, right? Right? Be perfect, right? He says, it's not enough. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So he tells you, you can't just love your neighbor. You have to love people who don't like you, who are not good to you. That's a pretty high order. Now he actually is saying, interestingly, it says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. It doesn't actually say in the Torah, hate your enemy. It doesn't say that. But he says, you've heard it said. So, that's the Sermon on the Mount. So that's the NIV. That's the same translation that you got in front of you.
And it says he's not teaching self-mutilation.
No. Yeah, we don't.
Blind man can lust.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, we don't take it literally. Though I will.
That we should feel as justice.
I don't think a blind man
I don't know. Guys, John, I know some guys who you're like, that guy's in a wheelchair. What's he going to do? But I don't know. Look, I don't know. But the point is he's not talking, it's not supposed to be taken literally. Though there are people who have taken that literally over the years when they feel like they can't control themselves, they actually
gouged
have
their
done
eyes
this.
out.
Yeah, they've done it.
Oh,
And they have hurt their bodies. Yeah.
Well, what was that movie?
you know, when.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
What's that?
It's Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Yeah, self-flagellation. So yeah, no, that's a thing. So yeah, so you can see that is a version of the Ten Commandments. That was a midrash, if you will, on the Ten Commandments. Now I will show you, by the way, when we go to Deuteronomy, which is also as I said, is the repetition of the Ten Commandments. Let me just get there. So we have in the Torah, you can see we have the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day. Now you're wondering to yourself, what? I'm supposed to keep the mitzvot that I charge you this day? Where are they? Where are they? Right? Well, I'll tell you where they are. In the chapter just before, we have the commandments. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So what most people don't realize, because we don't talk about it, is the Shema is actually referring to the Ten Commandments. And it's pretty clear. When it says, take to heart these words which I command you this day, they're talking about the words that you just read. And we don't think about that. We don't talk about it because the rabbis intentionally obfuscated that. Why? Because they didn't want you to keep 10 commandments. They wanted you to think about all the mitzvot. And there was a certain point in time in Jewish history where the rabbi said, and I'm telling you this in the context of the 10 commandments, where they said, let's stop talking about just the 10 commandments. When did it happen? It happened before Jesus, because Jesus had no issue bringing up other commandments that were not part of the 10. So by Jesus's time, rabbis, teachers were already talking about the commandments and trying to get people not to just focus on the 10. It's possible, again, based on Friedman's idea, that the commandments were seen, the 10 commandments were seen as a code. The code was a covenant, was an agreement that if you keep these commandments, God's going to keep you on the land. Well, by the time of Jesus, they already broke the commandments and we already were exiled. We came back, we re-inhabited the land under the Persians. There were Jews who never left, lots of them that never left. But when the hierarchy comes back and re-inhabits the land and rebuilds the temple, and there's the second temple that we talk about, by that period, they must have looked at the commandments like, again, well, they're just 10 of many commandments in the Bible. And let's not just focus on those 10. How do we know? Because the rabbis said that. And on top of that, when you read things like the Christian Bible, you realize that they were teaching that. Because the Christian Bible didn't exist in a vacuum. Jesus could talk that way to people because they already expected that kind of talking. He didn't say, and it says in the 10 Commandments to honor your parents, and it says in the 10 Commandments not to commit adultery. He just says you've heard it in the law. And he goes seamlessly between Exodus, and then he has Leviticus, and he has some Deuteronomy. He has laws in the Torah that he just grouped together. He didn't say, and it says in the 10 Commandments, follow the 10 Commandments. He talks about them all together. So I'm pretty sure, and we can tell by Jewish texts too, like the Mishnah, that they didn't want people to only keep the 10 Commandments. We believe that at one point in time, the 10 Commandments were everywhere in Jewish minds. That before the exile, maybe even, there were 10 Commandments everywhere. Like literally that a mezuzah at one point might have actually been the 10 Commandments, might have had the 10 Commandments written inside of them. We don't know that for sure. But there would have been 10 Commandments written all over ancient Israel. Versions of them, copies of them that were all over the place. But once they were broken, people said, well, we already broke those. We better not break those, and we better not break the other ones. And let's get people not to just focus on those 10. So the 10 Commandments become not less important, but they become part of a whole bunch of other commandments. And you'll see why in a second. But these are the 10. And again, in Deuteronomy, when we have this, it's almost verbatim. So you kind of look at where it's different. And we already know it says right here, Shamor at Yom HaShabbat. In the other version, in the first version, it says Zachor at Yom HaShabbat. remember the seventh day, and here it says observe or guard the seventh day. So there's one difference. And the rabbis knew that that was a little bit of a problem, that it says in one place Zachor, in one place Shamor. So they said, look, God said it at the same time. Some people heard Zachor, some people heard Shamor. Some people heard it, but it was said simultaneously, and you're supposed to do both. I heard Zachor v'Shamor b'dibur echad. Hishmianu el hamyuchad. Why did I know that? Because it's from Lachad Odi. It says the first line of the Lachad Odi, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. God said, Shamor v'Zachor in one word, b'dibur echad in one word. So they had to come up with an explanation, which is that God said both. We do both. Some people has got written down one place this way and one way that way. It's not the only difference, but it's the most pronounced difference between the two commandments. The other one is the one that John mentioned, which is, it says, Lo tachmod eshet re'echa. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. And then it says also here, the lo titaveh beit re'echa. And don't crave your neighbor's heart. This word here, velo titaveh, is added to the velo tachmod. So that's why they actually have in here a break between the two commandments, but a little space. But it's just these two words. Otherwise, the whole word is the same. I mean, the rest of the words are the same. Just these are added. Titaveh, which is a little bit more, by the way, problematic from the standpoint of craving. It's also not the common word for just desiring or wanting, but it is a little bit more, it's a little less coveting and more just wanting rather than coveting, which is tachmod, which is really, again, maybe problematic because it's, because you want that one in particular, or that it makes you get so focused on it that you want to steal it from them. So the next line of Deuteronomy says, Adonai spoke those words, those and no more, to your whole congregation at the mountain with a mighty voice. Well, wait a second. That's not exactly what happens, as we're about to see. But the author of Deuteronomy really wanted you to know that these 10 words were really important. And actually says, Adonai spoke those words and no more to your whole congregation, which I guess to some extent means that those are the ones that everybody heard. It's not like there's no more mitzvot, but everybody heard those. But that's what Deuteronomy says. And by the way, again, if you look at when Deuteronomy says it, when Moses says it to the people, he also tells them a little differently. Face to face, Adonai spoke to you out of the mountain of fire. I stood between Adonai and you at that time to convey Adonai's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain, saying, which is not what the Torah actually said in Exodus. It said, God told them not to come up onto the mountain. But here it's almost like Moses is saying, I kept you alive. I kept you away from the mountain, and I spoke I was in the meat. It's like God, it's like Moses taking credit for it. Well, it's Moses's standpoint. It's Moses's vantage point. Now you might say to yourself, well, how did anyone ever write this knowing that there's another version of Exodus? What's the answer, Mike? You know the answer. I've said it before. Nobody, the writer of Deuteronomy never expected you to read the two side by side.
That's right.
He never expected you to be able to hyperlink between the two and go, it says over here Shamor and it says over here Loti. He never thought you'd have that version. The writer of Deuteronomy thought that you'd be reading his history of it.
That's how you're supposed to.
And he did a good job of conveying the actual text. He took a little embellishment saying that Moses took credit for it. But remember, if Friedman is right, the author of Deuteronomy, or at least the editor who took Deuteronomy, wanted you to know a story that starts in Deuteronomy. Moses tells the history of the people in Deuteronomy, how they got here. He's telling this to the people, he's telling this to a new generation, right? And so he tells them the way he saw the story. Now look, whether you believe traditionally that the Deuteronomy was just Moses's telling of it, or you also could believe perhaps that it's written by a different author who had no desire for you to read Exodus, or didn't care whether you read Exodus, but didn't think you'd have it right next to it. Look, he has a little different objective with it. All right, so back to the text, because now we're done with the Deuteronomy. Any Exodus, sorry. Any questions from home? Anybody at home have any questions? Well, because back in Exodus, it says, the next thing says, All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. Well, that's kind of what Deuteronomy said too. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey, but not let God speak to us lest we die. And at that point, the people say, we don't want to hear from God anymore directly. And Moses answered the people, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of God may ever be with you, so that you may not go astray. So he's trying to, look, in here, it's also, he's helping, right? But it seems as though people in this case are really scared, really afraid. Not that they were going to rush off, but they actually were rushing away. It seems like in this version. Not that they wanted to get closer, but they actually want to go away. So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. And Adonai said to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, you yourselves saw that I spoke to you from the very heavens. With me, therefore, you shall not make any gods of silver, nor shall you make any for yourselves any gods of gold. Now, wait a second. We just heard this. We just heard this. What's this about? Not making gods of silver and gold? Just heard it. It was one of the 10 Commandments. Mike, why are you laughing? What?
Because they break it.
Well, yeah, they do. But there's another thing, which is there's 2 versions of the 10 Commandments here.
Oh, yeah.
In the first set of commandments, when we just heard it, everybody heard it. But there's another story here, which is that the people really didn't want to hear the 10 Commandments. And these commandments are very similar to the 10 Commandments, but they're not exactly the same. Look, it starts off with a commandment not to make any gods of silver or gold. Make me, yeah, right. Make me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your sacrifices of well-being, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. Huh. Well, this commandment seems to say that, well, one commandment I do is I don't make any gods of silver and gold. I make an altar of earth, right? Not of, not of wood, not of metal, an altar of earth and stone. And I sacrifice offerings on them. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you, which seems to imply it's more than just one place. It's more than just Jerusalem here. It's a little problematic. It's not what you'll see in Deuteronomy. And if you make for me an altar of stones, do not build it of hewn stones, for by wielding your tool upon them, you have profaned them. Do not ascend my altar by steps, that your nakedness will be exposed on it. So this is all part of the altar, right? Not making it out of stones and not ascending it, not going up it. Now, this is where the chapter ends. Now, if you're normally reading this, like we do in Judaism, the 10 Commandments just ended with a really weird law about not walking up an altar. And you go, well, what's going on here? It doesn't really make sense. The 10 Commandments, at least the first version of it, of God speaking, I would say, not even the 10 Commandments, God speaking at Sinai, I call it, really ends right here. It ends right here. There's another one, which is all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, which went back to what happened in chapter 19. And in this version, the people don't actually hear the 10 Commandments directly. They have Moses go and listen to them. And the laws don't end there, because it says, these are the rules you set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve you 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. Now you're going to say to yourself, well, wait a second. Where did this come from? It's another law. It's a law. Now, we in Judaism look at this now as mishpatim, more laws. But it seems as though these are laws that God gave to people at Mount Sinai too. Now, it's either in addition to the 10 Commandments, and They didn't quite hear them because Moses is in the cloud now and they're not there. But there's no question that these are laws. And where the Ten Commandments begin with theological laws, so do these, which are you make an altar. Well, you don't make other gods. You make an altar and you be very careful with the way you make the altar. And now these are other laws.
They're part of the 613, correct?
Well, they're all part, yeah, they're part of the 613. But these are also, whether you want to say it or not, however you understand it, these are laws given to us at Mount Sinai. Not all the,
613 are given them.
absolutely not. So let's take a look at these laws, because these laws might be kind of important.
They're all important.
These laws could be real important because they were given to us at Mount Sinai. So this first one has to do with people, which is slaves. So a slave, if he's a Hebrew slave, he goes free after 7th year, right? And what it's telling us is that,
Free after 6 years.
yeah, 6 years, the 7th year he goes free. He goes free in the 7th year. Means if you have a Hebrew slave, he's not your slave for very long, which is the laws of indentured servitude, which existed even in America.
And he doesn't have to pay you for his freedom.
Correct. Now, this indentured servitude was still in play up until the 1800s, where people were indentured servants. They're essentially slaves for a certain amount of time, usually 7 years, based on the biblical law. So what's it called? It's in the Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman movie, right? They come to America from Ireland. Remember that? Tom Cruise was an indentured servant in that. Starts out that way. What was it called? Yeah, Jacob. But this is a Hebrew slave. Only a Hebrew slave. So if you buy a Canaanite slave, it's not the law. But here it says, if a male slave came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. Not followed in America in the 1850s. You had no wife, no legal wife. The Torah had a law that was more stringent than American law when it came to slaves in the 1850s. Now you could say, there were people who said that this applies to the same Hebrew slaves that we read about before, but it doesn't exactly say that, because here it specifically says a Hebrew slave, and here it doesn't. If a master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. So here's an interesting corollary. Yeah, it's not what you wanted to hear, which again seems to imply that no, this is not a Hebrew slave. This seems to be a slave who doesn't have a lot of rights, because the children are considered part of the property. That he wouldn't have had these children if he wasn't your slave. So you essentially bred them. Pretty rough. But if a slave declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door of the doorpost, and the master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall remain his master's slave for life. So there is a way to stay with your family, and it means that you have to give up your freedom. We don't know how often that happened, but this ear piercing was considered to be part of the ritual of willfully becoming a slave. You're shaking your head, Mike. You don't like this.
Well, everything but the piercing. I mean, staying with my master would be great, but
Don't pierce. Yeah. Well, it shows you that you actually had to physically be marked for doing this.
It's not like with the little pin.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how deep it was, but yeah, how big it was, but it's not good. It's not easy. Look, it's one of the reasons why Jews frowned upon men having their ear pierced for a long time. because it was considered a sign of slavery. Well, there you go. But it was considered, that's partly why. It was also considered to be too effeminate, but oh, stop it. It was considered effeminate too, but yeah, it was considered partly a sign of servitude, slavery, to have your ear pierced.
You read something, I mean, I'm getting up to
What?
something about getting the nose piercing.
Yeah, no, it says in the Torah that women had their nose pierced. They had nose piercing. They were allowed to for beautification purposes. It was considered any part of the skin that was not permanent was considered to be, I guess, fair game to some extent. If it could grow over, it could heal back up. When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, yeah, Gloria, you were gonna say something.
I was gonna say, my Bible does not say bring them before God. Mine
What does
says
it say?
Bring them before judges. They use-
Yes, so here, let's look at the footnote here. It says, others say judges. Why does it say that?
Yeah.
Because the word here is clearly Elohim.
Ah,
Now, we normally translate it as God because Elohim is almost always God. There is the possibility for Elohim to be represented on earth by judges. So it's not without merit. It's one of the reasons why the footnote is there. But because again, how are you really going to bring a slave before God? There's got to be some court. There has to be some, but it could have been before the priest. The problem is there are places where Elohim is translated as judges, or it's implied that they're judges. And so you will have that understanding. Nowhere is Elohim a priest. So interestingly, priests are not representatives of God necessarily in the sense that we call them Elohim. But judges, there is a basis for that. Yeah, shoftim. So we use the word shoftim, but there are other places where it seems as though the rabbis have no issue saying that sometimes when it says Elohim and it doesn't seem to be God actually, that they're okay with that, which is why you have that translation. I mean, why you have that note. So it's just, it probably was understood as the people who are enforcing God's rule, which could be considered judges, but it's okay. I mean, I'm okay with either one on that one, because the point is that there has to be witnesses, or there has to be some understanding that a person gave up their slave, their freedom, became a perpetual slave on purpose. When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as other slaves do. Now, this is a weird one. By the way, why does it say when a parent? Oh, I know why. Because it says when a man. It doesn't say father or parent, but you're basically saying, don't translate it as, what does your translation say, Gloria? Does it say parent or man?
the man
Yeah.
sells his daughter as a servant. She is not to go free
Yeah.
as men servants do.
Yeah, so here's the issue. The word is ish, it is man, but the reason why they they translated it with a footnote, and the reason they did that is because who else has the authority and who else should be called? It can't be a daughter if it's a father. No one, you can't say that person's, and that's the word it says. It says bito, it says his daughter. So he can't be he can't have a daughter unless he's the father. So that's why they translated it as parent. But yeah, technically it's a man. I mean, I guess you could say he's the daughter of his house, maybe not his actual daughter. I think that's maybe why it's translated like that, because no one is ever supposed to sell their daughter. So that's kind of why, like, how could that happen? Now, the answer, of course, is the person's become destitute, and that's why they sold their daughter. This is just a fact. This happened, it still happens. It happens in some countries right now. I mean, it happens here illegally, yeah, it does. But yes, it happens openly in some countries. And so the Torah is saying that, yeah, it's going to, if it happens, not that it should happen, but if it does happen, it says, if she proves displeasing to her master who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. So if he doesn't like her anymore, he's not allowed to sell her, but he has to let her be redeemed. He has to let somebody come in and buy her and redeem her, not just buy her and own her, but actually allow her to be redeemed out of slavery. And that's the word hefta, which is like the word pidyon, like pidyon haben, the redemption, right? To redeem them. And if the master designated her for a son, you shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. So what's interesting is that if he actually says it's for his son to essentially have as a wife or as a concubine, she's actually now treated at a whole different level. So what we can say from this is that if he was going to take her for himself, he essentially has to allow her to not really be divorced from him, but essentially to be free, to leave as a free woman. But it gets even weirder or not weirder, but actually in some ways more righteous, if you will, if he was going to give her to his son, because he actually has to say, if he takes another into his household as a wife, he must not withhold from her, from this one, her food, her clothing, and her conjugal rights. Now you're going to say to yourself, what's a note here say? Ointments. So there's a big difference between ointments and conjugal rights.
Yeah.
Now, we understand it to be conjugal rights from the standpoint of essentially, again, she has the right to have the same rights that a wife would have. Because every one of those rights, and it's not translated as, we very rarely translate as ointments, is he has to give her food, clothing, and conjugal rights, which means that she gets to have children, which means she gets to have inheritance through those children. So even if she came into the house as a slave, she actually now essentially is part of the family, which is actually very, very advanced for those times, and even to some extent to this time, because you can buy a woman to essentially be a sex slave for your house, for your son, and she has no rights in certain countries. And arguably, even in this country 150 years ago, there's no rights. No woman had a right if she was used sexually or had children. She had no rights for any property. She had no rights to have a child. She could have had a child, but child had no rights. And the woman had no right to inheritance through that child. So when you're saying, well, conjugal rights, why would a woman want to have conjugal rights? Well, the bottom line is if he's sleeping with her anyways, he now has to give her conjugal rights, which means he actually has to let her have a baby, and he has to provide for her through that baby. So whatever that baby is going to inherit kind of passes through her. So bottom line is, this dissuaded people from essentially sexually exploiting women. Could they still get around this? Of course, I'm sure people got around it. I'm sure people did horrible things in that society, but this definitely dissuades people from doing it. If you have to essentially take care of a woman that you're bringing into your house for your son as a daughter-in-law, you might as well marry him off. There's no sense in buying a woman. It really, I mean, it's allowing it. It's saying the practice is acceptable, but it's not, you're not getting any benefit from it. What's the benefit? You're going to have a woman who you brought into your house against her will, and you still have to treat her as a daughter? I'm sure it happens, but it's definitely not, was definitely not encouraged. Look, this is one of the reasons why Jewish people did not have as many slaves as white people did in America, other white people. When Jewish white people in South Carolina had slaves, they very rarely had slaves that lived in their house because they didn't want to be held to this law. They knew what the law was, so they didn't have slaves. And if they had slaves, they had plantation slaves who they never saw. I mean, we know this because we have records of this. It wasn't that long ago. And we know people who had slaves, like Judah Benjamin and other high-profile Jews who were part of the Confederacy. They didn't have household slaves. Or if they did, and they could easily have had household slaves, They didn't have many of them. We don't have this. So people have asked before, like, when African Americans have Jewish names like Levi, Levi, or Cohen, how did they get those names? There's not one, we've never found evidence that there was a Jewish family that brought in slaves and they had children with them and that they're the descendants walking around. We haven't found any written cases of it. We haven't found any genetic cases of it. We do have interfaith marriages and relationships where there were people who had Jewish ancestors, were African American, but not as slaves. There's not people walking around like Thomas Jefferson's great grandkids walking around saying they had a Jewish slave owner who was their ancestor. And there were Jews who had slaves. We know they did, but they generally were working on a plantation and they had very little to do with the slaves. I'm not making an excuse for it. I'm just telling you the facts. That's why. And so any African Americans are walking around with Jewish names. It's not from their ancestor.
Last name
Of their owners. Yeah, but a lot of them also took last names of American heroes and American presidents and had nothing to do with their owners. Not every person who's walking around with the last name Washington was owned by George. Most of them didn't. They took the last names because they heard about these people. They were American heroes, Washington and Jefferson and Adams, and they took that as their last names. They willfully took them as their last names, Franklin. So it was not encouraged for Jewish people to have slaves and think that they could get away with it from the standpoint of like taking advantage of them sexually. These are all laws that the people got at Mount Sinai. One who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. Well, that sounds a lot like thou shalt not murder, except here there's actually a penalty for it. Yeah. It says right there. They kill somebody, you're put to death. Well, that's actually says right there. If a man did so by design, it came about. It did not. It did so, but not by design, right? So it not premeditated, but it came about by an act of God. I will assign you a place to where he can flee. So if it's a manslaughter case, it was an accident. As we read later, we'll read about it later. We have the cities of refuge where the people would go to. And it's in Numbers. So it says, does it just say here? Like ancient, yeah. So this is a place for asylum. Another one. When one party schemes against another and kills through treachery, you shall take that person from my very altar to be put to death. Right? That's the law against, you could say, like kind of what Ahab did, scheming against another person and getting them killed through treachery. And then again, penalty right there. One who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. Well, that sounds a lot like honoring your parents, except here it's said in a different way. You strike him and you get killed. That's really strict. Again, it says what the penalty is too. Look at this one. One who kidnaps another party, whether having sold or still holding the victim, shall be put to death. It's kidnapping, the law against kidnapping, and literally stealing another person. So either you're still holding on to them, if you sold them, or you still have them, you put, so even if you haven't gotten around to selling them yet. One who insults one's father, and here again has a little note here, reviles. The word in Hebrew is kalel. Mekalel. One who reviles his parents shall be put to death. So that's not just striking them, right? It's just striking them there. It's just reviling them. When two parties, does everybody get that, by the way? So it's not, I mean, this isn't just honoring your parents. It says if you do this to them, you're punished by death. This next one, we're going to get to, and we're going to finish with probably one of the most talked about laws in the world. Really. When at least now, when two parties quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist, and the victim does not die, but has to take to bed, if that victim then gets up and walks outdoors upon a staff, the assailant shall go unpunished, except for pain for the idleness of the cure. So there is, if you hurt somebody in a fight, but they don't die, but they do have to go to take a little rest afterwards. No, if they're injured, right? You have to pay them for their lack of work, for the lack of productivity. You pay for that, right? Loss of income. You have to pay for that. And you also have to pay for the cure. So you also you're held accountable. This is a really interesting law because that's not the case in America, right? If you hurt somebody, you're going to be sued for a whole lot more than their time off from work and their medical coverage. You're going to get sued for a lot of money, especially if you have a lot of money. They're going to sue you for a lot of money if you get in a fight.
It's gonna cost you a lot of money for the attorney too.
Yeah, it will. But even after that's all done, you're not going to just get charged for the damages for the time off from work and you're going to get hit with a whole bunch of damages. It's almost unlimited. It's almost unlimited how much you can get sued for, right? So the Torah says you can't do that. You have to pay for the idleness and the cure, but that's it. And that's it. But let's get to these. When a slave owning party strikes a slave, a male or female with a rod who dies, and then this must be avenged. But if the victim survives a day or two, this is not to be avenged since the one is the other one's property. So if the guy dies right away, if you beat the guy so bad that he dies right away, he could be avenged. You could actually be killed for killing a slave. But if he doesn't quite die, you're not.
Own him, so it's okay.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? But that's just one corollary. No, the next one's even weirder. Because this one is the one where you get to a whole lot of discussion on. When two or more parties fight, and when one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact. The payment to be based on a reckoning, which again, what does that mean? As the judges determine.
Okay,
What does yours say?
court allows.
Pretty much the same.
Same thing.
But if other damages ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, and bruise for bruise. So that is the famous line, eye for an eye, ein tach an ein, eye for an eye. Now, again, we normally would say, as the notes say, oftentimes in the Bible, that we don't take that literally. We don't actually poke someone's eye out if they hurt someone's eye. We make them pay compensatory damages for the eye, tooth for tooth, right? The problem is, of course, it's life for life, right? How do you reckon that? Because that we assume to mean a life for a life. You actually have to pay for it, right? Nefesh tachat nefesh. That it actually is, the penalty is death for killing somebody, right? So
Mine has a footnote that says, the so-called law of retaliation, as its context show, was meant to limit the punishment to fit the crime.
yeah. So the idea is that it's equal, right? That there's a equal value to it. But that's not what I want to focus on right here. I want to focus on this one right here. Because this one's the problematic one. Because this one, my friends, is the basis for every discussion on abortion from the Jewish standpoint. This is the only place in the Torah that we did. I didn't say the Bible, because even in the Bible, there's not much. There's a couple lines that people look at from the Bible and say, well, what does that mean? But from the Torah, where there actually are laws, where we can actually derive not what someone likes to say, or what we'd like them to say, or what was beautiful to be said, but what does the Torah actually say? And the Torah here says, in the case of a pregnant woman losing a baby because of a fight, and we heard before and we heard after that a person has to pay for a life or with a life, right? And they have to pay compensatory damages, or at least whatever is accountable for killing somebody. That is not the case with the fetus. So, according to this, the person is fined according to what the husband's, the father of that child would say. Okay, so they have to come to an agreement, which means, again, if they don't agree on it, they go to court and there's a decision rendered. So from this, we can derive, and some people, of course, have tried to figure out, what do we know about the status of a fetus within Jewish law? It only can come from here. This is the only text we have. And the text itself says is that the fetus does not have the same rights as an existing life. So it starts from here.
It says nothing in here about the maturity of the fetus.
Correct. Now, this,
Interesting.
now I will say this. This doesn't really answer anyone's question, I know, from what does Jewish law say about abortion. But what it does speak about is the status of the fetus, which is that it does not have the same rights as a life. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have any rights. It also doesn't mean we can extract too much information from this, but this is the only place the Torah deals with a fetus. So we don't really know. But I will tell you that this is what it says, and this is where the arguments and the discussions emanate from, because they all come from here. They all come from Exodus chapter 21, 22. That's it. It's the only place we talk about a fetus in the Torah, in the 5 books. So I will tell you this. There is a problem in this country because we have a hypocrisy on this issue. And we have rules in this country that really don't make sense. And I'll tell you why. Because we will try, if somebody kills a fetus in a car accident, you're tried for murder or involuntary or even whatever, some level of manslaughter. I won't say definitely what it'll be, but they'll be tried for killing that fetus. If that fetus is aborted, there's no law for it. So it doesn't quite make sense from that standpoint. Either you can't, I mean, it doesn't make any, all I'm saying is it doesn't make any sense. That fetus is either a human being or not a human being, because if you said that it's a human being and someone can be tried for murder because of it, because they killed it, then how can someone perform an abortion on that same fetus and not be held responsible for it? That doesn't make sense. I'm not saying, and again, I'm not saying anything from the standpoint of what we would say from the conclusions that we would take out of that. But that is a somewhat schizophrenic or idea of what a fetus is. An American law, I'm just saying. From Jewish law's point of view, the person wouldn't be subject to a criminal penalty for killing that fetus. They'd have to pay the price for it that the father would say that they'd have to pay. Now, some people might not like to hear that, but that's what the Torah actually says. That's what the Torah says. The Torah is fairly practical about it, which is that there's a value to the fetus. It was a potential life. It could have been healthy. But they also say, what if it hadn't been healthy? Can we execute, let's say the fetus was not viable. Can we execute somebody for killing a non-viable fetus? This is the problem. So Judaism treats a fetus as a potential life, not as an existing life, but as a potential life. But it all emanates from this law. So the rabbis 2,000 years ago talked about this law. They talk about it today. This is where they have to derive Jewish law from, which is that the fetus is a potential life, does not have the same rights as an existing life, but it is a potential. So what does that mean? It means that Jewish law always says that the existing life of the mother takes precedent over the potential life in all cases. In all cases. So by the time that we knew more about fetal development, the rabbis had already come to the conclusion, even 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that if the fetus as it was coming out was killing the mother, you were obligated to terminate the life of the fetus, even if that fetus was viable, if it was going to kill the mother. So if it was tearing apart the mother, you had no choice but to actually terminate the life of that fetus. Now you could say that's pretty cruel and heartless. I can see what you're saying. But remember something. Up until very recently, we were dealing with a situation where 50%, 40, 50% of children were born dead? You're going to kill a mother for a 50% chance that the child would live? And so a lot of decisions were made on that knowledge. When this was first given to us thousands of years ago, the infant mortality rate was so high that how could you say we are going to make a decision between an existing life that we know is here versus a life that may live? And so I will tell you, my take on this is understanding that Jewish law is based on practicality, almost always based on practicality and based on protecting existing human life. So the problem is, if we've caught up medically to a place where we have to reevaluate this, we have to reevaluate it. And so my guess is that we're just starting to understand and kind of comprehend what kinds of changes we're going to have to deal with when it comes to Jewish teachings on abortion. Now, I will tell you today, it should come as no surprise, that the Jewish teachings on abortion are much stricter in the Orthodox world than they are in the conservative and Reform world. But where both Reform and the very strict forms of Orthodoxy still agree on is that the mother's life takes precedent over the infant or the fetus before it's born. That is where it still exists. But again, the Reform movement, and probably the most liberal forms of Judaism, or even people who are not connected really, but who are still claim to be Jewish, would say, look, we have to make Jewish law comport to our feelings about where abortion law should be, or we'd like it to be. And so they're not really being honest by what they're trying to do. They really don't care about Jewish law. So let's be honest that you really would break Jewish law if you could anyways. But they'll say the Jewish law allows for the mother to be protected to the extent that if the mother's psychological well-being is at stake, then you're allowed to terminate the fetus.
But again.
Which means that if a
the maturity of the fetus
correct, but there
and the viability.
but you start to have that within the Talmud. So by the Talmud period, which we're talking about, 1,500 years ago, there were already discussions in the Talmud about viability. Because they understood maybe more than people did 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 10 centuries before, they started understanding it a little bit better. Today, we have even a greater understanding of fetal development. The law of Israel is fairly close to where I believe American law will eventually get to, if American law is able to develop without there being people losing their minds over this issue. Israeli law is tolerant of, is accepting of abortion up until a certain point. And, pardon me?
Just period.
Pretty much, yeah. And then after a certain period, you need to get medical evaluation in order to terminate the fetus. I will say that perhaps we could come to that.
You really think that America?
I said perhaps. I don't hold out my, but if cooler heads prevail and people actually can think about this, then I think perhaps we could. But right now it's such a hot button issue and people use it to actually affirm their own political agenda that sometimes, again, is just partly connected to that.
And lie about
Yeah. And people, when people actually step back for a second and start thinking about it, and you present it to them in a way where you say, well, look, can we have some discussion about what we know about fetal development, especially when we'd be very protective of the fetus, as we would be if somebody got in a car accident and said that their 8-month-old or 8-month viable fetus perished in a car accident, we would probably be pretty upset with that. So all I'm saying is that people have to think about this. They actually have to, this is going to force people to have really, mature discussions about something that they don't really want to, they'd rather just react to rather than think about it. So Israel has, I think, actually come up with a really sound policy when it comes to that. But I think the bigger issue, and one of the things I look at a lot, is the rates of abortion. And I think that one of the things that you have to look at is what are the rates, what happens in those countries where the rates of abortion are high, where abortion is essentially a form of birth control. And I think if you look at it across the board, when you see where those countries are, those are the countries that are completely devoid of morality and any sense of protecting life. So the countries that have the highest rates of abortion, Russia, China, places where human life is not held in high regard. So, to me, you look at Israel's rate of abortion and it's very low by Western European standards. And I think it reflects this idea that, look, Israel takes life seriously and doesn't look at abortion as a form of birth control, as an accepted form of birth control. So I think there's a certain kind of level of responsibility that you have to treat people with, and an understanding that there is a consequence for their behavior. And I think that helps. If we look at again, and everybody goes, well, this woman had an accident and this and that. It's like, but when a woman's had 7 or 8 abortions, something's gone wrong, right? You wouldn't say, well, that's normal behavior. That's accidental. So why can't people have that discussion saying, look, and that was very common in Russia, especially during the Soviet Union days, for that to happen. It was cheaper for people to do that because they didn't have accessible birth control, but they had a medical system where they could get an abortion. Sometimes they had to wait, 2 or 3 months in order to get the abortion, but they had no issue doing it. So I can tell you this, it's not just a question of what your laws are, but you have to also look at what's happening in that society that's, creating the situation. So I again,
And the value put on life.
yeah. And so I think, I'll just finish with this today. I mean, if you look at, I do look at it, and I think it's reflective of, what's happening, in those countries. I'll just show you briefly. I'm not going to show you the whole list because it's not. But I mean, look at these countries. I mean, these countries are all either formerly Soviet or communist countries, or pretend to consistently, to still be countries like that. I mean, I'd say the most westernized, obviously, here is Estonia, which has been made part of.
China's at the bottom.
Well, it's bottom of the top 10.
Yeah, I know that.
And I just want to point out, by the way, Joanne, that those statistics are from 1998, and those statistics are not right, because China does not. There's no information in China that the government hasn't already twisted. No, but they're lying. We don't know how high the rate is in China.
Right.
It could be 3 times higher than that. We have no idea. We just know that that's what they'll tell you that it is. Yeah, so they partly was because of China's policy, but China doesn't have that policy anymore. China is begging people to have kids now. They can't figure out how to get people to have kids. They screwed up. No, they're very worried about it in China, trust me. And what's happened is they took away the rule. They took away the rule 15 years ago, hoping everyone would have kids. Didn't happen. Now they're trying to give people financial incentives to have kids. It's not happening. So China's in a real problem now because they don't have a replacement. They're not replacing their population. And the reason is because all these kids that grew up with no brothers and sisters, they don't want to have more than 1 kid. I have friends there. I know. I talk to them. I know what they're like. They don't want any more kids. They don't want to share. They also don't want to really be married for very long, which is why the divorce rate in China is so astronomically high. They have an entire generation of people that are selfish, that are self-centered, that don't know how to share because they never had a brother or sister. They never had to learn how to share as kids. They don't want to share with a spouse. And so they have a very, very low rate, by the way, of even getting married in China. So they have a huge problem there. As you know, they also had the when they had the one-child policy, people were aborting females all over the place. They had a huge drain of women. So they were worried, how are we going to find women for all these guys? So they said, well, we'll bring them in from other countries. Guess what? It wasn't even a problem. They didn't want to be married. So China has a huge problem now that they got into. And they're going to, I think at some point, they're probably going to have to mandate people having kids because they've created a situation where people don't want to have kids. So we don't really know what the abortion rate is there, but it's pretty bad, as you can see in Russia, which is that annually for 1,000 women, you've got and again, you're talking about women who in some cases are not even of childbearing years. But those statistics we assume from Russia are fairly accurate. But these ones, especially from Vietnam and some of these other countries, and the Estonian one's probably pretty true. But and Romania is true too. So yeah, it's pretty serious. You can see Ukraine's up there too. It's former Soviet Union. I mean, they're all former Soviet Union except for Vietnam and Cuba and China, which were, and Romania. They were
These are pretty
Eastern
big.
Bloc. Yeah. I think it's actually let's see. Let's see when this is, let's see when the, let's see. This is, let's see what this is now. What's our rate? It's not showing. Oh, it's showing we're in the kind of the red. We're in the red area. Let's see where Israel is. Israel's down here. You can see a lot of countries don't even report, right? All the Arab countries are not reporting. The Muslim countries over here too. You know, Iran, the rest of those countries, Turkey, they're not even reporting. But Israel is like the only country in the Middle East that even reports it. So, but you can see they're in the low rate for industrialized countries. You can see some countries here, you know, like Ireland didn't have, you know, legal abortion for a long time, but you can see some countries in Europe are lower than others. But the redder they are, the closer to orange they are, the higher they are. The darker they are, the lower rates they are. So you can see Israel's is down there, and then India is pretty low. Mexico's pretty low, pretty religious country. They don't. Well, it's not even religious. Even it's just they frown on. You know, it's just not accepted. So, let's see if the WHO's information is here. Let's see if this is. Yeah, let's just see if there's a country. No, this isn't. So, you know what? Let me just see one thing by individual countries. So let's see. Since you asked, and this is about the newest information you can get from them. But I look at this stuff. I actually, you know, I'm kind of weird about that. Looking at weird statistics, especially looking at Israel and stuff like that. What does it say? I know. I told you. I get. I'm not really a data person, but I guess I am certain things. Wait, one second. Let's see what the, yeah, you can just see what the penalties are. Let's see. I just want to see if they have any other data. No, I'm looking to see what the actual numbers are. Yeah, it doesn't, I don't know. I'm not sure if I can get you the actual one, but there you go. I'm going to probably wind up. John doesn't like this because I'm just infected my computer with viruses. John's going to say you're. I know, but whatever. So the point is that this is a question for another, for a person who likes these statistics. I do read them. Let me just see if this one has anything I can show that's actually on the rates. But I do look at it, and I do see that Israel tries to, you know, not allow women the right to have control over their bodies, but at the same time try to make sure that the rate is low. Israel does not want to encourage people to have abortions as a form of birth control. All right, folks. With that, I will bid you adieu. Thank you, everybody. We went a little bit longer than normal, but it was great having you all here. And I'm sure I upset somebody tonight unintentionally, but anyways, but feel free to email me if I did. Take care, everybody. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rabbi.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, Joyce.
Bye.
But I know, I'm. just-
No, come here, come here.
Goodbye.
Come here.
All right,
Wave right over here. Everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
here to say goodnight to everybody. Oh, I look over there to say goodnight. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Love you.
Night.
Love
Love you, Joyce.
Love you all.